thank you to AOPA, Avemco, and ForeFlight for their generous sponsorship of this episode of the More Right Rudder podcast.
Welcome to More Right Rudder podcast. I'm Beth Stanton, NAFI's Director of Publications and Editor. This is More to the Story, a series where we delve deeper into some recent articles published in Mentor magazine. Today, we welcome Jason Miller. In the July-August edition of Mentor, Jason authored Making Aviators, the Formative First 25 Hours. Jason is a CFII with more than 20 years of flight instructor experience and was the 2009 Western Pacific Region Flight Instructor of the Year. He is the founder of The Finer Points, a leading resource for pilots seeking to refine their flying skills and deepen their understanding of aviation. Through the Finer Points podcast, training programs, YouTube channel with 138,000 subscribers, Jason helps make complex topics both accessible and memorable. Jason, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Beth. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for having me.
Well, I'm kind of like fangirling here because, you're like our celebrity flight instructor, Jason Miller of the Finer Points. And you've been doing podcasts since podcasts were invented. And so here you are on ours. So I'm guessing most, if not all, of our listeners and watchers have heard of Jason Miller and the Finer Points. So what I would love, maybe we can just kick off a little bit about, give us sort of the 60-second overview of how you got started, this whole endeavor of creating the Finer Points.
Yeah, that's fascinating. I think it was part of, realizing I did not want to be an airline pilot. That wasn't going to be my path. And, we go back to, I started teaching in 2002. And I really just love to teach flying. I love working with people. Sometimes people will say to me, isn't it boring? You say the same things all the time. But the reality is each person's different, as you know. And when you're teaching, it's really about unlocking their understanding of what you're talking about. So it's always interesting. I find the people that get into flying are just extraordinary people. And I love helping them achieve excellence. And that's everything we've done, the podcast, the YouTube channel, our ground school app, our CFI club, all of it comes from that idea. How can we help make excellent aviators?
And one of the things I love about the process is it is a journey. You didn't start out with 138,000 subscribers in a YouTube channel. Like that happened over time. And I think that's kind of an interesting way of how we always grow and develop professionally and what we learn. And I think that, along the way, you notice oh, I see a need for this, or I see a need for that. And then you created that. So when it came to me approaching you about writing an article for Mentor. Now, again, it's like shooting fish in a barrel. You could have written about anything, and we did spitball what should you write about? So tell us a little bit about how you sort of landed on this topic of the formative first 25 hours and just how important that is in flight training.
Yeah, it was interesting timing because when you asked me, we had just finished writing the private pilot syllabus, which is freely available in our ground school app. And so training was, the first 25 hours was fresh on my mind, but it really started a long time before that. I think what I've noticed over the years, and it's been, more than 2 decades now, it's my 19th trip to Oshkosh, it's
Wow.
been, it's been a lot of years talking about flight training. And I find that almost no matter what the topic, I end up talking about almost the same things. Really, in that time, my theories about flight instruction have kind of just been distilled and gotten clearer and clearer and clearer. It's not like it's gotten broader. It's gotten more and more refined to where I really, the law of primacy in learning, the first way you learn it is the way you tend to do it. We could talk about that for hours, really. And I could tell you stories about how I see that come up in students, and it just makes you think as a flight instructor. And I'm constantly trying to refine that. We have such a huge responsibility, because especially in a primary student, to really build a solid foundation for them. And, one of the things we heard when we wrote the syllabus from we have a CFI club with, a few thousand CFIs in it. And one of the things they were saying to us in the feedback is, I love the syllabus. but why does the solo come in lesson whatever, I can't remember where it is, lesson 22, you know, and they'll say on the sporty syllabus it comes in lesson 14, and in Rod Machado's syllabus it comes in lesson 9. You know, why the delay? We're going to get, you know, pressure around that. And I really believe in investing for a student, with the student, investing in those fundamental skills. Everything we talked about in the article, from ritualizing the act of flying, which I think is extremely important, but to the more simple skills too, you know, like the rudder control, the where you're looking and when you're looking there. If you don't have that stuff worked out before solo, it's very difficult to sort of go back and rebuild it. You know, you have that early opportunity to lay the foundation, and if you do it properly, then everything downstream of that comes relatively easy. So we sort of built this program that is, it's not so much like a straight diagonal line, but it's more like a hockey stick, you know, where it starts out maybe a little slower in the beginning, while we develop those fundamentals and make sure that the foundation is the way we want it to be. And then everything after that just accelerates. So all that stuff was fresh on my mind when you reached out. So I thought for sure we're going to talk about the first 25 hours.
Well, I love the way, again, like how things, and by the way, everybody who's listening to this, you know, like all of this content that is out in the aviation ecosystem, Jason's The Finer Points podcast, NAFI's More Right Rudder podcast, these articles in Mentor Magazine, you know, fill in the blank. I just put out today's edition of eMentor newsletter where I curate from dozens and dozens, if not hundreds of different aviation sources. Somebody has to make all this stuff. Like it has to come into being. And like, I always find it fascinating, sort of like, what's that spark? Like, what's that neuron that triggers? It's like, I'm going to write about this, or I want to talk about this. And like you said, you just got done doing the syllabus. So that was on your mind. And so we're super grateful that you did write that. And you also did a presentation at Oshkosh, a forum of the same title. But I wanted to just circle back to something you said a second ago. One of the things you wrote in the article really landed very significantly and profoundly with me. Jason wrote, altering a behavior established under the influence of primacy is not a casual undertaking. It's comparable to correcting a bone that healed improperly. To set it right, you must first break it again, realign it, immobilize it, and allow time and structure to solidify that correction. I was shocked when I read that. I mean, that was such a great analogy there, but it was really impactful and powerful. I mean, that really drove home how important this is. So, this led me to also wonder, I'm sure in your 20 plus years as a flight instructor, you've seen plenty of bones that set incorrectly that you needed to reset. So, what are some of the implications? What does it look like when somebody had a bone set wrong and it needs to be reset? Like how do you, I mean, you described what you need to do, but how do you do that? And is it possible?
Well, these are such great questions. I'll answer the last part of that first, because I've come to a place in my career where I wonder, it really depends on how much time you've had to let the bone heal, I suppose, if we're going to stay with the analogy, because there's always a certain amount of stress that would cause somebody to revert. And you don't know what that stress is. You can see, you know, I won't tell the entire story, but I've had one student in my career who, who crashed an airplane, and he was okay. His passengers were okay. So it's not a horrible ending, but they totaled an airplane after I worked with him. And it was the law of primacy, I believe, that not that caused the crash, but had we done things slightly different in his primacy, the crash never would have happened, you know, and that's the kind of responsibility that we carry. And I bring it up because in his behavior in that aircraft, I never, ever saw him make this mistake. I thought we had it healed. I thought we had the whole bone wrapped up. I thought it was good, but there was one particular day that was extremely stressful for him, extremely stressful at work, extremely stressful with his relationship, time pressures, like all of the Swiss cheese lined up. And he did something that I hadn't seen since the first week of training, you know, and it was like, wow, where did that come from? So we have a huge responsibility. And how does it work? I think that to do it, you have to have both sides on board. So like when I talk to CFIs, I talk a lot about onboarding your student into this idea. And there are various, so first you have to even see if it's possible. Like if somebody comes to me and they want an assessment of their flying, I'll fly with them. And generally in that first assessment, I'm not going to be jumping down their throat. I'm not going to be slapping them on the wrists or anything. I'll just be kind of watching and taking notes. And once I develop a training plan based on what I see, I'll have to sit down with that person and see if they're up for it. I mean, that's because if the learner is not on board for the learning, then forget about it. You'll never get it done. And there's various tools instructors can use. I find, for example, that an athlete coach analogy has a lot of legs. It goes a long way. You can tell a person who's coming in for flight training that they are the star athlete. They're going to win the game. They're going to be the superstar. They're going to be the hero, right? And my job is to get them there. Say, in my generation, it was like the Bulls basketball, like Phil Jackson to Michael Jordan. I mean, Phil Jackson can't jump from the free throw line and dunk the ball. Only Michael can do that. But Michael needed him to like get the best game out of himself, right? They had a symbiotic relationship that way. And so you really have to make sure your student's up for it. And then I kind of describe it to them, so if they are up for this process, it's going to take time, and that time means money. So we're going to take some time and we're going to invest in these skills for them. There will come times where they want to throw me out of the airplane, and I'll be the first one to tell them that. Like, I will ratchet up the intensity as this goes on, and I want you to know that that's part of my job. And it's my job to know when to push and when to back off. But you really have to leverage if you can, you have to leverage other laws of learning, like the laws of intensity. And I can tell you how it worked for me, because I am this guy. I got my private in 1998, August of 98. And I had a young flight instructor who did my private, and she was great. I really enjoyed working with her. I don't know where she is, but I hope she's flying for the airlines and having a wonderful career. She did a fine job, but she only knows what she knows, and so I left with, some poor disciplines, little things all over the place. In some cases, big things, rudder control, centerline discipline, really no ritualistic approach to the flying. And when I finally met my instrument instructor, who really became my mentor, he wasn't so subtle. He was kind of I jokingly say he was pretty sadistic. He came from a different generation. He had no issues with hitting me on the hands with metal sticks or jabbing me in the ribs or whatever it was to get the effect he wanted. In some cases, he was straight up insulting. I remember one day he said, "You call yourself a pilot, you can't even stay on the center line. Like you call yourself a private pilot and you can't even hold the center line." He would insult me sometimes, but I knew what he was doing for me. And my instrument rating took 2 years to get. And that wasn't because we were working on instrument skills per se. It was because somewhere early in the training, he said to me, "I can't teach you to fly instruments because you don't really know how to fly the plane. So we're going to have to double back, and we're going to have to teach you how to fly this airplane. And then once you know how to fly the airplane, I'll teach you instruments." And all of my friends telling me, like, "This guy's milking you. This old guy just wants your money. Like, it's been 2 years. Like, what are you guys even doing?" Like all of that stuff in one ear. But I knew what he was doing for me. So I was on board with what he was trying to get done, and I could take it on the chin. I'm not that kind of instructor. I'm not insulting my students or physically hitting them. But that's what he used for the law of intensity. So that's the break. There has to be some sort of intense break of what you've done. You have to kind of surrender, or your student does, surrender to the idea that we are going to change things fundamentally. And then once the change has been made, that's where the real nagging has to occur, because that's the cast. You can't let it stray at all from the formula that you've now introduced. And then you have to do that for some period of time until the things you're trying to teach become fundamental. And, like with the instrument rating, for example, I require that people talk in front of the airplane. So if you can't tell me what you're going to do in a minute and a half, there's no way you're going to do it when we get there. So it's a lot of like, when I get to the waypoint, I will make a right turn to a heading of 040. I will switch my CDI from GPS to VHF. I will throttle back to begin the descent to 2000. I'll enrich in the mixture and I'll run a checklist. So now I know in a minute and a half what I'm going to do. Early on in the process, when I introduce that, when students get stressed, they stop doing it. They stop talking, they get stressed, they go into their head, and they just start to try to keep up with the airplane. I know when they're ready by the fact that when I get them stressed, they actually dig into the talking. So like you'll see a fundamental shift where if I, an easy way to stress an instrument student is just say, hey, you ready for the next approach? And they're all going to say, yeah, I'm ready, before they know to slow down. And what I'll find in advanced students or students that are further along in training is as soon as I say that, they'll maybe power back the airplane to slow down and they'll start talking in front of the airplane. Like the thing that I gave them ends up being a safety blanket. It has now become the way they do it and the way they feel most comfortable doing it. And when you see that shift happen, you know that the bone has set, so to speak.
Well, I'm so fascinated that you told us your story about your instructor your instrument instructor who slapped you around, because you were your own exhibit A. Like
I was,
you,
yeah.
and it's not to say that you weren't a confident pilot from your first instructor, but you were like, you were the person that had to sort of relearn things. Like you went through that yourself, Jason. So I really think that probably the reason you can do what you do and have this insight is because you lived it, right? Like you
Yeah.
know what that's like. You know what it's like to maybe like ingrain a habit that's, not be able to land on the center line or whatever. There's that saying, like, I know when I flew competition aerobatics, that saying perfect practice makes perfect.
Yeah.
Not just
Right.
practice makes perfect, because if you go out over and over and over again and you set what you think is a vertical upline and you're 10 degrees off, you've set that muscle memory that's the sight picture and that's what it should look like. So if we do something over and over incorrectly, we sort of build the wrong muscle memory. So having that quality instruction. So this leads me sort of to my next question / conundrum that maybe you can give us some insight into is, I think the entire flight instruction community recognizes that high quality flight instruction is so crucial for creating competent and safe aviators. And that isn't always the case. Currently, you have a lot of, young, low time flight instructors teaching and sort of perpetuating that. So you're on the ground, you've been doing this for decades. Do you have any, besides what you're doing yourself, do you have any insights into, like, as an industry, how we can help make sure that those first 25 hours are impactful in the good way? And what can flight instructors do? First of all, they have to recognize it, like you said, but then, like, once you recognize it, you can want to do something, but not be able to do it. So are there resources? Are there mindsets? Are there, what can a flight instructor who's listening to this right now, who wants to be the best that they can be, what can they do?
You mean beyond using the finer point syllabus?
Well, and let's talk a little bit about that more. We don't have to necessarily this moment,
Yeah.
but I would definitely like to talk about that, because there are resources out there, lots of resources, some better than others. But yeah, so Exhibit A, like you just said, a quality resource to reference.
Yeah, and I think that like a lot of the training, I really believe in investing in core skills. I don't think that you can't put a band-aid on poor aircraft control, for example. I was having this discussion with the training department up at Epic recently. They do a great job, by the way, of this, very centered on aircraft control and learning how to fly. But all these things that we're getting, like envelope protection, and I don't want to pick on Cirrus too much, but like parachutes and all of this idea that, okay, well, if we can't fix the problem, let's just box it in a little bit. We'll use automation to prevent loss of control accidents and all of this sort of stuff. But I'm really just stuck on the idea as a flight instructor that in over 100 years of teaching, wherever we're at now, 120 years ish of trying to teach people how to fly fixed wing aircraft, there's not really that much that we have to teach. I mean, a light single engine airplane is relatively basic. You've got the left turning tendencies of the engine. You've got the drag created by the ailerons. You've got airspeed control. So just pitch and power control. How do you fly this thing slow? And how do you control like a lot of the maneuvers that we test on slow flight, go arounds, power off stalls. A lot of it is just making sure that the student can manage the left pull, I'll say, or the left turning tendencies of the engine as they add power. that they understand fundamentally that releasing your back pressure or forward pitch breaks the stall, that they understand that in low speeds you're using more ailerons, so there's more rudder necessary when you deflect those ailerons, whether you're rolling in or rolling out of a bank. But I'm almost at the end of the list of things that you'd want to see. And I think that, to answer your question, more, I don't want to call them games, exercises, I guess, lessons where we're just going out for the sake of building a skill. I think if we invest in that as a group, that we'd be surprised at the end of the day how easy it is to demonstrate something like slow flight or to demonstrate a power off stall. So the ACS maneuvers that we are requiring our students to demonstrate for examiners before they get certified, the skills required to do those maneuvers are the whole aircraft control bit. But instead of going out on day one and showing them, okay, this is slow flight, let's power back to 55, and this is slow flight, I think there can be entire lessons that seem not related to that, that almost, if I'm a sailor, so like, when you tack a sailboat, sometimes you go the wrong way just because you know that when you turn the right way, you're going to go a lot faster. Like you'll see in a sailboat race, some boats going, you're thinking, where the heck are they going? They're going totally the wrong way from the buoy, but they're trying to put themselves in a position where when they finally turn toward the buoy, the wind is stronger, the boat goes faster. They'll be the ones to get there first. So, like, just as an example, I have a student who's just about to solo, and as much as I talk about it, he's having a heck of a time bringing his feet into the game. He's having a heck of a time. He'll use rudder when he rolls into a turn. He'll fail to use rudder rolling out of a turn, or he'll not use enough in a climbing right turn or whatever. And then, like I said, this isn't rocket science, right? So how do I teach him? How do we get through that? And so an example might be, well, we're going to go out on a lesson where he, for the whole lesson, will not be allowed to touch the yoke. So he will be flying with his feet for the whole lesson. And there's no ACS maneuver that he is going to demonstrate ever where he doesn't touch the yoke. There's no time in his real life of flying with his family someday that I want him to fly only with his feet. It is specifically designed to just put into his foundation that your feet are part of this. And I think people would be surprised if you go out for a lesson or two and do that with your students, where they're literally having to push the rudder to get the secondary effect of the yaw before they bank. And then they have to stop the yaw by pushing hard on the left rudder and swinging the low wing through the air to bring it up. If you do that for a few lessons, you likely won't ever have to address the rudder again. Though that will be just a part of this person's repertoire. So going out and demonstrating a power off stall recovery will be a no-brainer. Another example might be, take a grease pencil or a dry erase marker and put a little mark on the side of the window that I refer to as the Lindbergh reference, like the left side or right side of the forward window, and have them take the throttle all the way to idle and then all the way to full and then all the way to idle and all the way to full, and just use their feet to hold that mark exactly where it is. So to answer your question, I think there are exercises or games or drills that we can do with students that aren't necessarily related to any specific maneuver, but are an investment in basic aircraft control. Once the basic aircraft control is there, the maneuvers on the ACS are actually quite easy, and the students will be doing the things that the examiners are looking for to check those boxes, really, because there aren't that many. I mean, most of the time we're trying to make sure the students can manage the left pull of the engine, that they can, control the angle of attack and the pitch and the power. I mean, there's just a handful of things to control a light airplane, and taking the time to get those things right pays dividends.
So you have a lot of creative, what you're calling them, exercises or, strategies to go out and practice. If you're a brand new flight instructor and, you're, getting in the right seat for the first time or the third time with a new student, how do people like that who are starting out find out about these kinds of tricks and maneuvers and things? I mean, I know that we as flight instructors share the knowledge with each other, but sometimes it's still kind of hard to find it. And I swear this isn't a plug for Jason's finer points, but I know he's put together a lot of resources. So since we have you here, and again, there's tons of great resources out there, but since we have you here, over the years, you've seen things, you've developed resources. So tell us a little bit about some of the resources that flight instructors can reference that you have created.
Well, for flight instructors, it's easy. They could really just go to learnthefinerpoints.com/dashboard, and they get access to our free CFI club. And if you look there, you'll find our syllabus. You'll find for every lesson in the syllabus, you'll find a video where I explain these things, like why this lesson's here, what exercises I would do, and if you're seeing your student do this, I would do the following, or if you're seeing your student do this, I would do the following. So there's just tons of resources available there at the CFI dashboard. But in our syllabus itself, whether you go to the dashboard or whether you get it in the ground school app that your students will be using or that the instructors get free access to, I've made a distinction between skill building days and demonstration days. And this is the answer to the question, is why does the solo come, where it comes in the syllabus, is because there are skill building days where we literally say, this is what you're going to go out and do. This day is not related to anything other than building skills. As an example, I always introduce lazy eights to a private student, or at least the first part of the lazy eight, because it's the only maneuver that teaches overbanking tendency in a slowing turn. If you, like, a lot of pilots will go through all the way through private certification and not understand that if you put an airplane in a 2-degree bank and pull, you're going to end up in a 45-degree bank. That slowing down in a turn has an overbanking tendency associated with it. So we teach privates the lazy eight because we want them to know that skill, not because the lazy eight's on the ACS. And sometimes this is where you'll sometimes hear people say, well, that's a waste of their time and money. Why would you go out and spend an entire day flying with your feet, or go out and spend a morning showing them overbanking tendency and slowing turns? And my answer to that is because that initial investment has everything downstream of it go way faster than it would. If you understand, well, if you understand all these things, where to look and when to look there. And that's another thing that we do in our ground school app. It's a mobile app for iOS, so like iPads and iPhones. But one of the things that allows us to do is we've created what we call tap target study questions, where we'll show people from a student's perspective, from a camera mounted in the student seat. We'll show people a turn, for example, and then the turn will start to go bad. It'll start to descend. And we ask the student to touch the screen where they see it and when they see it, so that using the app, we can actually teach students where to look during various maneuvers, how to see pitch in a turn, how to see bank angle in a turn. And in that way, then when they sit down in the airplane, they're looking at the same picture they saw on the app. They know exactly where the reference point is. And so we've really done everything we can to try to create resources for the students that will show them these skill building days. As you go through the flight videos in our app, there are days where coordination exercises is one of the lessons. It's not an ACS maneuver, but it's how do I learn how to use rudder? And so for the instructors also, each one of those lessons is in the syllabus with an accompanying video that shows them why we're doing this.
That is, I'm just like I'm in awe of technology that we
I
can,
know.
I was studying to get my private pilot about 15 years ago. And a friend of mine he gave me this book that he had when he was learning how to fly back in even like the 70s or 80s. And
Yeah.
it was like this plastic covered little small book I think it was called Flight Maneuvers Visualized. I
Yes,
wish
I've seen that.
the book's in the other room.
Totally. I feel old now because I remember that. That's
And
not
you
even that
open it
old.
up and it has like the black and white paper version of what you just explained. Like,
Yeah,
this is
exactly.
what the sight picture will look like if you
Right.
look left, right, or center. And so I guess the concept's the same, where to look,
Yeah.
and what it should look like. But now we have, like flight simulators, and we have like touch screens, and we have like
Yeah.
much more interactive, dynamic ways to visualize these things as opposed to just reading it in the little paperback book.
100%. And in some cases we draw the line. I mean, we've had people ask us, why don't you guys film in 3D or 360 and then allow the student to sort of look around? And we specifically don't do that because we're trying to teach them where to look and when to look there. Like, exactly, like it would be cool if they could look around. I mean, that's kind of a fun thing, but it's not showing them, no, in a steep turn you should be looking right here, that this one specific place, or in slow flight right over here, that's where all the data is. And I really believe, and you're an aerobatic pilot too, so I always feel like aerobatic pilots are really the best at this. But for every flying problem in an airplane, there's an answer called where do I look and when do I look there? Where do I get the data to know what the plane is doing? And yeah.
Yeah, right. That was one of your sections, where to look, when to look there in the Lindbergh reference. And I'm really glad that you brought that up a little bit earlier in the conversation here. And I'm glad you brought it up in the article. So really quick, it's so important, the visual aspect. And I think you said 90% of the time people should be looking outside the airplane, 10% looking inside the airplane. And I think the tendency now, especially with avionics and iPads, is people are inside the cockpit more.
Mm-hmm.
So talk to us a little bit about how can we, besides beating your student with a newspaper, keeping them looking outside the window?
Well, it's one simple way that this is always dramatic. If anyone's flying in a standard panel airplane, just take a piece of 8x10 notebook paper and skewer it over the attitude indicator knob so that the corners are still, you can always peel back the corner and see the airspeed, or peel back the corner and see the altitude. It always shocked me how much a small, tiny, thin 8x10 sheet of paper could actually make such a huge difference. But if you, and you can kind of set your students at ease a little bit and say, look, I'm going to put this here. It's not that you can't look at the flight instruments. You can look anytime you want, right? Like you can look anytime you feel like it, just peel the corner back and check your speed. But just putting that small barrier there so they can't stare at it, and using a dry erase marker, if you can bring like what I call the heads up display, and just literally draw on the window, you'll see that immediately the 90% is outside. And if anything, they're not coming in enough. And you have to remind them, okay, every now and again, you have to check the data. And you can do the same thing in a glass panel airplane by just making the PFD dark. So like in the early stages with a glass panel airplane, I'll just make the PFD dark. We'll use the backup gauges, which are typically located far enough away that no one's going to stare at them, DA-40s aside. And then put the MFD like on a traffic page or something sort of meaningless to try to bring them back to the idea that this is just flying a wing, and that's about where you look and when you're looking there and what your pitch and what your power is. So yeah, that's probably the best way. Or sometimes I'll actually like speak it to them, where I'll say outside, 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 inside, outside, outside. Like you're outside the airplane most of the time, and then you glance in to get the data and you're back outside. And just, really being a nag, or in some cases, I try to leverage the law of intensity, not the way Richard did. Richard, my mentor, would, like you said, he would beat me up. But you can do it other ways. Like if a student's getting extremely slow, you can kind of let that go a little too far. If they're like fixated outside and they're starting to get real slow, you can let that go a little too far. And maybe you'll hear the stall horn, or maybe you can tell them when it starts to get to that place, why don't you check your airspeed? And it's kind of a shock. You can sometimes create a moment of intensity that way.
I love that you were so effective that you got them looking outside more than inside. That's quite an accomplishment.
A whole new challenge.
I'm just so grateful. Again, the flight instructor community, we all need to help each other and lift each other up. And the work that you've done over these many, many years, Jason, obviously your one-on-one work with your students, which by the way, they're super lucky to have you as an instructor, by the way, all you guys.
Thank you. I'll make sure I tell them that.
Just tell them I said that.
Okay.
Not just your one-on-one work with people, but you scale that influence and it affects the entire community. And we're so grateful for the work that you've done with NAFI. You guys, all this stuff that folks do for Mentor Magazine, just as a plug for Mentor, this is all volunteer contribution. So every article you read in Mentor Magazine has been written as a volunteer contribution, as an act of service to the community. So, we couldn't do this without the generosity of people like Jason and everyone who contributes to Mentor. So thank you. And all you guys out there listening, I know you have ideas and wisdom and experience, and I invite you to share it with a mentor. You could always reach out to me. And we just are so grateful, Jason, for the work that you've done over the years. And just give us one more time how folks can find you.
They can find the finer points online at learnthefinerpoints.com. If you're a CFI, just put /dashboard at the end of that, and you can get access to our flight training app and all the resources we have. But yeah, I want to thank you, Beth. What you guys are doing at NAFI is really important and really great. Having the professional organization and the peer support, all of that's really huge. So thanks for all the work you do.
Well, thanks so much, Jason, for writing the article for Mentor, for coming on the show. Hopefully this won't be the last we see of you. It's funny because Sarah Stout, who is the usual host of More Right Rudder, I sort of beat you. I beat her to you.
Okay.
And I said, I'm going to interview Jason. She goes, darn it, I was going to get him. So I don't know. Maybe Sarah's going to have you on the show too at some point here in the future. We'd love to have you back. But thanks again for taking the time to join us here today.
It's very flattering. I'd be happy to join again anytime. And thank you for having me. That was fun to be here.
Well, everyone, thank you so much for tuning in and for joining us for more to the story. And we will see you next time on NAFI's More Right Rudder podcast.